What do you do with 9 million people who just violently and unsuccessfully tried to escape your control? You forced them to stay, but now what? Oh yeah, and 1/3 of those people were until recently enslaved. This is the problem faced by the president and Congress in the wake of the Civil War. I really don't think we think enough about just how insane the years after the war must have been. Like, what happens to the 1 million-ish soldiers who just spent the last 4 years committing treason? Do we put them all on trial? What about Southern landowners? Do they get to keep their plantations? And most importantly, what about the 4 million Black Americans who are now free but have nowhere really to go and are surrounded by white Americans who literally see them as an inferior species? Do we let the Southern states just come back and forget it all happened? Well, I mean, kind of, if Andrew Johnson has anything to say about it. Both Lincoln's and then Johnson's plans for how to rebuild after the war, known generally as Reconstruction, were pretty lenient on the Confederacy. Lincoln had wanted any state that rebelled to re-enter the Union as long as 10% of the voting population swore an oath of allegiance to the U.S. 10%? He was okay with 90% of the population not promising to be loyal to the U.S.? Similarly, under Lincoln's plan, all Southerners would be granted a full pardon except for high-ranking Confederate officers, and he promised to let Southerners keep their property, although now without their enslaved workers. A few of the Southern states, including Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas, had reconstructed governments before the war was even over, but the debate over what to do with the South really came to a head after Andrew Johnson stepped into Lincoln's probably very large shoes. You see, Congress was made up of mostly Republicans, the party of Lincoln, but Johnson had been strategically chosen as Lincoln's VP because he was a Democrat from Tennessee. He was chosen to appease the border states and keep them in the Union in the midst of the war. And now he's the guy in charge of dealing with the South? That's awkward. Johnson attempted to continue with Lincoln's plan, going against Congress to do it. He began pardoning anyone who would swear an oath of allegiance, requiring special presidential pardons for Confederate leaders, all while Congress was not in session. By the time they returned to work, Johnson was already celebrating the end of Reconstruction, with most Southern states on their way to being readmitted into the U.S. Sure, slavery was abolished thanks to the new 13th Amendment, but there weren't many other protections put in place for Black Americans in the South. And so in those months after the war ended, when Johnson was in control, white state governments were putting in place black codes to effectively keep them all subjugated. Violence and race riots against Black Americans trying to assert their new freedom erupted across the South. In Memphis, a rumor went around town that Black Union soldiers had fired upon white police officers, and so white people formed mobs, attacking Black men, women, and children around town. The Union soldiers were put in jail, leaving the Black community and any sympathetic whites who tried to protect African Americans totally defenseless. In the end, 75 people were injured, 100 people robbed, 5 women were violently violated, and 91 homes, 4 churches, and 8 schools were burned and destroyed. For 2 days, white mobs, including police, firemen, and business owners, roamed the streets, attacking freedmen's camps and Black neighborhoods. Oh yeah, and the white police officer that was supposedly shot by Black troops, yeah, it turns out he actually just shot himself in the leg on accident, so there's that. In the same year, 1866, in New Orleans, it was even worse. African Americans, including 200 Black war veterans, were participating in a new state convention to undo the Black codes that had been passed by all white voters a few years earlier. As they were marching, they were met by armed white men, many ex-Confederate soldiers who confronted the crowd. Shots were fired, and in the end, 48 people were dead, 44 Black Americans and 3 white radical Republicans who were there in support. The so-called New Orleans Massacre was the clearest evidence that Black Southerners would need the protection of the federal government for a long time, possibly generations. And Congress saw all of this happening under Johnson and said, oh, hell no. The most socially progressive wing of the Republican Party, nicknamed the Radical Republicans, took control of Congress in the midterm elections of 1866. They finally had enough sway to override Johnson's veto, and they instituted their own, much more intense Reconstruction plan. Think like Hunger Games level? Not quite, no fighting to the death, but almost. Under the Congressional plan, the former Confederacy was divided into 5 military districts administered by Union generals. They also implemented new rules restricting the president's ability to control his own cabinet. Congress was especially concerned about Johnson getting rid of some of Lincoln's more radical cabinet members, especially Edward Stanton. As Secretary of War, he had a considerable amount of control over this new military phase of Reconstruction. And what do you know? Johnson fired him. Congress was like, you can't do that based on a law we passed about 5 minutes ago, so they impeached him. The Senate failed to remove Johnson from office by a single vote, but he went down in history as the first American president to be impeached. The next president to be formally impeached wouldn't be for another 130 years. Hey, Bill. Anyway, with Congress in charge of Reconstruction, protections for Black Southerners were prioritized. The new 14th Amendment is super important. It established birthright citizenship, which meant all formerly enslaved people were automatically U.S. citizens, and provided equal protection under the law for all citizens. This amendment, in addition to the 13th abolishing slavery, had to be ratified by any state wishing to re-enter the U.S., in addition to a promise to protect Black men's right to vote. Congress also tasked the U.S. military with registering new voters to ensure that Black men could participate in state elections. A few years later, Congress went further and passed another constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or national origin. Much to the chagrin of women everywhere who were like, you couldn't add one more comma and give women the right to vote too? Oh well, we'll get them next year, in 50 years. So how successful was the Reconstruction era at rebuilding and reunifying the country? It is true that a lot of progress was made in the 10 years of Congressional Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified, freeing enslaved people, establishing Black Americans as citizens with equal protection under the law, and giving all men the right to vote. Protected by the U.S. military, Black men began to vote and run for office. In fact, during the decade of Reconstruction, over 2,000 Black Americans held government jobs, 700 Black men were elected to public office, including 14 U.S. representatives and 2 senators. Hiram Revels was the first Black American elected to the U.S. Senate, and he actually took one of the Mississippi Senate seats that had been vacated by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Ugh, beautiful. A few years later, Mississippi also elected the second Black senator, a formerly enslaved man named Blanche Bruce. During his time in office, he pushed for payment and protections for Black war veterans and for better treatment and recognition of Native Americans, who, by the way, were not granted birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment because, according to the government, they were subject to tribal laws instead of being subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Ugh, we'll talk about that later. Black men stood side by side with white Southerners at state conventions to ratify their new constitutions and re-enter the U.S. Backed by carpetbaggers, a derogatory nickname given to Northerners who moved down to the South to influence these new states, and scalawags, or white Southerners who supported the federal government, traitors in the eyes of former Confederates, the Republican Party came to control most state politics in the South from 1866 to 1876. In addition to politics, a federal organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau played an important role in supporting newly freed Black Americans. The Bureau provided food, housing, and medical aid to the millions of freed, formerly enslaved people across the South. In addition, they set up schools to educate Black people of all ages, in addition to poor white people. The first commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was Oliver Howard, a West Point grad, and the president and namesake of the future Howard University, one of the most prestigious historically Black colleges in the U.S. And actually, the founding of HBCUs across the former Confederacy is an enormously positive legacy of the Reconstruction era. Sure, this happened because most Southern colleges refused to admit Black students, but we're going to see Black leadership emerge from these HBCUs for generations to come, like Dr. King's alma mater, Morehouse College, for example. However, arguably the most important support system that was strengthened during the Reconstruction era, at least the one that outlasted most of the others, wasn't anything administered by the federal government or decreed in a law. It was the Black church. Religion had played an important role in enslaved communities for centuries, but during the Reconstruction era, fully independent Black churches were established across the South, in which Black leaders had full control and a voice for the first time. These became central to the Black community and would also be an important tool for the education and mobilization of Black Americans in their ongoing push for equal rights. But as I'm sure we can guess, the day-to-day Black experience in the South was not as radically altered as Congress hoped, because newly freed Black Americans were still overwhelmingly poor, illiterate, unskilled in anything beyond agricultural labor, and looked down upon by those with local influence. Although Congress had wanted to redistribute some of the land in the South to formerly enslaved Americans as a form of reparations, that was ultimately deemed too controversial by moderates. So property and wealth stayed in the hands of white Southerners. And many Black Americans were forced to take up jobs as laborers on the very plantations where they or their families had been previously enslaved. If they did have land of their own, it was typically rented from former enslavers. And Black sharecroppers are going to become entrenched in a cycle of debt that closely resembled the way things had been before this whole Civil War thing started. And remember, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. So in the years after Reconstruction officially ends in 1876, more on that next episode, we're going to see a new type of slavery emerge across the South that criminalizes and targets Black men especially, and then rents out their labor as prisoners to white Southerners. It would take generations of support from the federal government and years of enforcement of Reconstruction policies to ensure that Black Americans had a relatively fair shake in the South. Unfortunately, we ended up only getting 10 years. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.